So I recently left Twitter for Blue Sky, follow me, because Elon Musk, who we all know was a major Trump funder, has turned Twitter into a MAGA propaganda hellscape, and it wasn't even that fun to begin with. I'm not interested in participating. And while Elon's overt manipulation on Twitter is pretty horrifying to watch, it's only the latest in a very long timeline of billionaires buying media companies in order to control the narrative. And Trump's latest win shows definitively the propaganda works. The conservative media ecosystem with Fox News at its epicenter has created a sealed feedback loop, and it's responsible for brainwashing your least favorite cousins, who you'll likely have the pleasure of seeing across the Thanksgiving table very soon. It might be impressive if it weren't so disturbing. I wanted to find out how right-wing media grew into the multi-billion-dollar fact-resistant propaganda machine we see today. Who put up the funding to build this vast ecosystem in the first place? This is who's funding the right-wing media. Let's get into it. It can be really hard to tell who owns what in our current news media landscape, and where the money comes from is having an increasing impact on the bias of the news sources. So it's important to have an understanding of how money impacts the biases in the news media that you consume. For example, look at this recent headline. Judge delays Trump immunity decision in New York hush money case. In over 300 articles Ground News found on this story, we can compare the articles side by side to see how different sources are framing the same story. For example, left-leaning HuffPost, owned by Verizon Communications and the Roberts family, uses the headline, Trump's hush money judge delays decision on verdict again, whereas right-leaning The Daily Signal, owned by the Heritage Foundation, uses a headline with a more positive spin. Judge pauses all deadlines in Trump's New York case based on election win. It's subtle, but knowing who owns these publications, like I didn't know that the Daily Signal was owned by the Heritage Foundation, that can help you interpret the biases that affect their reporting. This is where Ground News comes in, and why I've been using them for over a year. Today's partner, Ground News, is a great tool for understanding the news. Here you can see the overall bias distribution with perspectives from around the world. If you scroll down, you can see the overall reporting practices of each source, with 70% of sources rated high or very high factuality. You can also see more information about who owns which source. Only 13% are independent news sources. All of these tools can be really helpful to provide more context to your own echo chamber. Especially as we're going into the holidays, you might have some FaceTime with your racist Uncle Rick, and knowing where his sources are coming from can better prep you for interactions with family members that you don't agree with. My favorite Ground News feature at the moment is their blind spot feed. With a bird's eye view of issues that tend to get more attention from the left or right than others, I can easily step out of my echo chamber and understand how people like your Uncle Rick have their narratives shaped. I'm especially impressed by how Ground News goes beyond simple news coverage to focus on media ownership and the financial forces behind news stories. By following the money, they help expose biases linked to ownership interests and other influences that shape what and how news gets reported. To get unlimited access to all the features I mentioned, scan my QR code, click the link in the description, or go to ground.news/Leeja to get 50% off the same Vantage plan I use to stay informed, which comes to about $5 a month. It's their best deal of the year, only for a limited time. Subscribing supports my channel and helps an independent team keep the media transparent. Thanks, Ground News. Before we get into who's bankrolling this bullshit, I think it's worth taking a step back to understand what we mean by right-wing media and how it became so powerful in the first place. Many factors have contributed to the ecosystem we see today, including media fragmentation in the digital age, increasing political polarization, and the massive profitability of rage bait and the culture wars. But what makes the conservative content ecosystem uniquely powerful is that it's simultaneously isolated and unified. Unified because even though these outlets compete amongst themselves for clicks, when it comes to reinforcing the GOP's narratives, they're marching in lockstep. And isolated because conservative outlets are first and foremost contrarian. They define themselves in opposition to the mainstream press. And that's why it feels so impossible to get through to Trump voters. They exist in a sealed feedback loop and fundamentally distrust the sources the rest of us value. And that's thanks to a decades-long conservative crusade against the media and educated elites, because you can't go to war without first defining an enemy. The Republican obsession with liberal media prejudice dates back to at least the 1950s, but didn't properly boil over until the 1970s. See, old Ricky Nixon didn't much like the press. Forever a paranoid, from early in his career, Nixon believed reporters were out to get him. And as president, he had a plan to fight back. Aiming to undermine the press's credibility, the Nixon administration started pushing a new name for them, the media. Apparently, the press sounded too dignified and serious for Nixon's liking, as though the press implied a sacred duty to, be a watchdog serving the public's best interests, by overseeing government affairs or something. The media, on the other hand, had the perfect ring to it, calling to mind manipulative, slick and slimy Madison Avenue types. A popular book also helped push the narrative. In 1971, The News Twister hit shelves, claiming, despite weak at best methodology, to have scientific proof of liberal media bias. By the time Nixon went to war with the Washington Post over Watergate, many conservatives were primed to see the president's downfall not as the righteous result of his own crooked actions, but as a coup orchestrated by the media against a beloved, twice-elected Republican. As the 70s gave way to the 80s, this distrust in the media, as it was now known, began to fester. Americans' trust in media peaked in 1976, when 72% of the population said they trusted mass media a great deal or a fair amount. By 1996, that figure had dropped to 53%. So what the happened in the 20 years between 1976 and 1996? Well, at least 4 major things. CNN, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, the rise of Rush Limbaugh, and the birth of Fox News. In 1980, CNN launched the first 24-hour cable news channel, changing the speed of breaking news forever and arguably taking reporting outside the realm of the public good and into the realm of rage bait for profitability. As a cable news station, CNN had far fewer restrictions than broadcasters using the public airwaves. Public broadcasters like CBS, NBC, and ABC were considered public trustees with a duty to serve the people. Part of that responsibility included the equal time rule, also known as the Fairness Doctrine, which required newscasters to air competing views on important issues in approximately equal measure. The doctrine was written to prevent broadcasters from abusing their power and setting a biased public agenda. Doesn't that sound nice? In the 1970s, the Federal Communications Commission called the Fairness Doctrine the single most important requirement of operation in the public interest. And then in 1987, Ronald Reagan ruined everything. Link to buy this t-shirt is in the description. In 1987, the FCC voted 4-0 in favor of ending the Fairness Doctrine, claiming that the policy hurt the public interest and violated free speech rights. Broadcasters had complained that the Fairness Doctrine was overly burdensome and actually inhibited their ability to cover issues of public importance. Which on a certain level sort of makes sense. The Fairness Doctrine ultimately required broadcasters to decide which issues were important to the public and then decide which perspectives should be presented in equal measures. But the FCC preferred to instead leave it up to broadcasters to decide what to air based on how the marketplace reacted, because, as we know, the market always knows best. Furthermore, broadcasters argued that the rise of cable TV made a diversity of viewpoints available that hadn't existed in previous eras, meaning people could seek out sources aligned with their interests rather than expecting the big 3 broadcasters to cover every conceivable viewpoint on the nightly news. The problem is that this logic eliminates the notion of a single source of truth. If nobody is required to even pretend to be fair and balanced in the public's interest, then the line between news and editorial starts to blur really fast. Many members of Congress agreed that eliminating the Fairness Doctrine was a slippery slope. They criticized the FCC for trying to flout the will of Congress and said the decision was wrong-headed, misguided, and illogical. They even managed to pass a bill codifying the Fairness Doctrine. But Reagan vetoed it, and they couldn't get enough votes to overturn his veto. And to be clear, I'm not saying whether or not the Fairness Doctrine was necessarily a good policy. It's not black and white. Plenty of people, including President Obama, thought it was trash and a real threat to free speech. All I'm pointing out is that after the Reagan administration eliminated the doctrine in 1987, the media landscape transformed almost overnight. And along with cable news, talk radio was one of the driving forces, thanks in part to one man, Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh started airing political commentary in Sacramento, California in 1984, but it wasn't until the Fairness Doctrine was repealed that he became a nationally syndicated star. On August 1st, 1988, The Rush Limbaugh Show debuted on 56 AM radio stations across the U.S. Within a few months, it had been picked up by 100 more. Limbaugh understood something that most people didn't yet appreciate. Talk radio programming is entertainment, not journalism. He brought the outrageous radio shock jock shtick that was all the rage in the 80s to political conversations, offering a kind of brutal catharsis for conservatives who felt marginalized and silenced by the evil mainstream media. By 1994, 1994, The Rush Limbaugh Show was carried on some 650 stations and had an audience of 20 million listeners. Limbaugh had tapped into a powerful niche, and his success demonstrated the ravenous appetite for outspoken conservative content that has since blossomed into the vast ecosystem we see today. As Charles Sykes put it in Politico, we now live in the world Limbaugh created, including a political culture that is driven less by facts and ideas than by slurs, rationalizations, conspiracy theories, and alternative realities. Limbaugh helped to normalize cruelty, racism, and misogyny among a new generation of talkers. By 1995, 70% of all talk radio listeners identified as conservatives, but they wouldn't be confined to talk radio for long. Australian media mogul and real-life supervillain Rupert Murdoch got into the 24-hour cable news game in 1996. At the time, he also owned the New York Post, 20th Century Fox, and HarperCollins, and that's just in the US. Despite its name, Fox News was never a journalistic endeavor. From the start, it was an explicitly political operation. With devoutly conservative political consultant Roger Ailes at the helm as CEO, Fox News was explicitly created to be the Republican Party's megaphone. By the time the Bush administration declared war on Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 attacks, Fox News was marching in lockstep with the White House, including everything down to individual words like how to refer to Osama bin Laden.
I remember when Osama bin Laden was the biggest news in the world. We're going to call him Usama with a U. We're going to follow the White House on that.
The notes were very much in line with what the administration was putting out there.
Common vocabulary, sometimes known as inclusive code language, is an essential feature of cult programming. Language is a powerful tool for building solidarity, instilling ideology, and ingraining an us versus them mentality. And over time, the repeated use of emotionally charged buzzwords and special terminology serves to separate those who are inside the group from those outside of it, thus sealing the ecosystem off from outside logic. This has been done in spectacular form in conservative circles thanks to Fox News and the surrounding conservative news ecosystem. And the great trick is that while much of what Fox and its ilk put out is bullshit, there are just enough verifiable facts mixed in to make every claim seem plausible, and the audiences eat it right up. This past summer, Fox News hit its 90th consecutive quarter as the #1 most watched cable network in the country. Not news network, cable channel, period. A 2020 Pew Research survey found that Republicans trust Fox News more than any other outlet, and that the more conservative a person is, the more likely they are to say they trust Fox. But though Fox News largely sets the right-wing media agenda, the secondary players in the ecosystem have shifted over time. Around the 2016 election, the far-right news website Breitbart emerged as a key force of conservative disinformation and attempted to unseat Fox News as the de facto voice of American conservatism. According to a Columbia Journalism Review analysis, in 2016, the 5 most widely shared stories in which Breitbart referred to Fox were ones aimed at delegitimizing the network as the central arbiter of the conservative news. Unwilling to be portrayed as part of the mainstream media, Fox News was quick to course correct. Within a few months, its coverage was more closely integrated with Breitbart and the rest of the conservative media ecosystem, and its authority was mostly restored. Still, the challenge revealed a deeper truth. In today's hyper-fragmented media landscape, there are now alternatives to the alternatives. And even once tiny blip websites posting fringe conspiracy theories like Breitbart can grow and be used as a tool to shift the overall conservative conversation nationwide. These days, while Fox still reigns supreme on cable, podcasts, YouTube videos, Substack newsletters, and boutique platforms like Rumble have become the go-to sources for the most extreme right-wing perspectives. And there's a revolving door between Fox and these more extreme platforms. Many conservative celebrities who rose to fame while working for established media organizations have continued leveraging their profiles after leaving those outfits often in disgrace, including Megyn Kelly, Bill O'Reilly, Tucker Carlson, and Steve Bannon, whose podcast The War Room was named the top source of misinformation in 2023 by a Brookings Institution study. The relevance of trusted individual commentators over actual news-gathering organizations speaks to a unique moment in American history at which trust in mass media has reached an all-time low. As of this year, only 31% of respondents to a Gallup poll said they felt a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. So instead, Americans are putting their faith in individual content creators who sometimes say things their audiences want to hear. You probably wouldn't be tuned into this show right now if you didn't understand that impulse. And it never ceases to amaze me how many comments I get from people calling me out for being biased and not presenting fair, equal, and unbiased reporting, despite the fact that I am not, nor have I ever claimed to be, a fair and balanced source of journalistic reporting. I'm not a journalist. I care deeply about the factuality of my sources, but this isn't live on the ground reporting. I condense the work of real journalists into easy-to-digest content and provide additional context that news sources don't, including my legal knowledge as a lawyer. That's the value I provide to you. And I hope to God that in addition to watching my videos, you also read actual news articles from a variety of sources. But the prevalence of people confusing YouTube commentators for fair, unbiased journalists is indicative of the consequences that happen when you have a deeply divided populace with a poor education system whose distrust in the news means there's no single source of truth. So they seek the truth out in alternatives. But the very important difference between me and the right-wing commentators we're talking about is that not only do I genuinely care about facts, but also that my sponsors don't get to tell me what to say. The same apparently cannot be said for commentators like the Tim Pools of the world. In September 2024, Tim Pool and half a dozen other conservative content creators came under fire after a DOJ indictment alleged that they'd been sponsored by Russian propagandists to spew disinformation to their social media audiences. Allegedly, 2 employees of the state-controlled media outlet Russia Today orchestrated a $10 million scheme to distribute English-language videos consistent with the Kremlin's goal to weaken U.S. opposition to Russian interests like its war in Ukraine. Though the DOJ didn't allege any wrongdoing by the influencers and commentators, noting that they were actively deceived about the source of the company's funding, let's not let them off the hook entirely. Because regardless of who was paying, the conservative commentators were still perfectly happy to accept money to spew disinformation. This wasn't talking points about quality in an ad for a mattress. This was disinformation about current events presented as truths, and none of these commentators bothered to check the facts or give two shits about what they were actually saying in exchange for money, allegedly. One of the commentators allegedly created 130 videos for this fake Russian company. And our collective distrust of news sources that have proven over decades to be credible in exchange for relying on independent third-party non-journalist internet commentators means our media landscape is more vulnerable than ever to the influence of nefarious actors. And the $10 million the Russians spent buying out a handful of influencers is small potatoes compared to the kind of funding being pumped through the broader right-wing media ecosystem at any given moment, even with explicit foreign policy goals in mind. For example, the popular conservative news website, the Epoch Times, is just one of the U.S. news outlets aligned with Falun Gong, a religious movement that opposes the Chinese state. Since launching in 2000, its publications, which aim to foment anti-CCP sentiment, have promoted conspiracies about Democrats, election fraud, and communists to pro-Trump Americans. Though it's ridiculously easy to make a buck off of right-wing conspiracy peddling and fear-mongering, profit isn't always the main driver anyway. It's influence. Because when it comes to controlling the media and the message, Republicans have long understood the importance of having their own media to push their propaganda. As the conservative movement began to coalesce during the second half of the 20th century, its operatives had a big-picture strategy to control the full continuum of information production, from universities to think tanks to media outlets. A 1997 report by the National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy revealed how conservative organizations had aligned their grant-making around a 3-pronged mission designed to help political conservatives shape public and elite opinion. Prong 1, developing right-wing media outlets. Prong 2, developing conservative public affairs programming on public television and radio. And Prong 3, right-wing media critics to exert pressure on the mainstream media into covering the right's political and policy agenda. And it worked. By 1995, before Fox News even entered the chat, media references to conservative think tanks far outnumbered references to center or left-of-center research institutions by nearly 7-to-1. Even so, Republicans have remained convinced that the liberal media monster poses an urgent, existential threat that must be stopped, and thus continue pumping funding into alternative news organizations. And like political donations, the media money can be difficult to trace. My fantasy of giving you a cute little flowchart went out the window when I realized how many nonprofits, PACs, and donor-advised funds are involved in the whole scheme. That said, some players are significantly more committed to the media influence angle than others, and I think it's worth naming and shaming at least a few. First up is David David D. Smith, executive chairman of his daddy's company, Sinclair Broadcast Group. Today, the right-wing media empire is best known for gobbling up local television news outfits and forcing anchors across the country to spew identical Republican talking points. In 1995, when the company went public, Sinclair had 13 TV stations and 8 markets in its portfolio. Today, it controls 185 stations in 86 markets. The acceleration point came in 1996 when the Telecommunications Act loosened some restrictions on media ownership, allowing Sinclair to more easily expand into new markets. Most of Sinclair's holdings are local TV news stations with immense built-in trust with their loyal audiences, and that trust is ripe for abuse. Studies have shown that when Sinclair buys a station, its coverage of national politics increases significantly, and the tone of all coverage shifts to the right. For example, Sinclair stations have followed Trump in characterizing crime as a grave threat, despite violent crime decreasing significantly in recent years. Next up, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏. When he launched the Washington Examiner in 2005, his goal, like Murdoch before him, was to create a conservative alternative, in this case to the Washington Post. 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 insisted that the Washington Examiner's op-ed content was to be produced by conservatives and conservatives only. Today, 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 houses the Washington Examiner and his other media properties under Clarity Media Group, a subsidiary of the 𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 Corporation, which also owns multiple hotels, oil and gas wells, and, obviously, Coachella. Yes, the music festival. Next up, Ferris and Dan Wilkes, a pair of evangelical Christian billionaire brothers whose fortunes derive from oil and gas fracking, who have each poured millions of dollars into right-wing media companies that promote climate change denial and push anti-LGBTQ dogma. They've given at least $8 million to 𝗓𝗓𝗡 alone, the unaccredited edutainment platform with video titles like Build the Wall. 𝗓𝗓𝗡 was recently approved for use in Florida schools and is angling to appear in more states, including the Wilkes' home state of Texas. In 2015, one of the brothers put up nearly $5 million to help Ben Shapiro launch the Daily Wire. According to scholars who've studied the influence of big oil in the conservative right, the Wilkes brothers have played an outsized role in funding and shaping the conservative and evangelical right in Texas and nationwide, because they, like so many Republicans, are keenly aware of how important it is to put your money into your megaphone. And then there's hedge fund billionaire and former computer scientist Robert Mercer, who was the single biggest donor to Trump's 2016 campaign, throwing $13.5 million behind him even before it was cool. Mercer rarely speaks in public and never to journalists, but his spending makes his beliefs clear. He gave $10 million to help Steve Bannon usher in a new era at Breitbart. He's a major donor to the Media Research Group, an organization that calls itself a media watchdog on a mission to correct liberal media bias. And he has a $10 million stake in Cambridge Analytica, the company famous for collecting personal data from millions of unsuspecting Facebook users to target political ads for Trump's 2016 campaign. Yikes. Next, there's shipping supply magnate Dick Uihlein. This Tea Party Republican was the top conservative donor for the 2022 election cycle, to the tune of $82 million. And his foundation supports conservative media outfits, including Real Clear Media, which has 14 sub-brands, including the polling aggregator Real Clear Polling and the right-wing news site The Daily Caller. Both of those outlets are also supported by numerous other major conservative donors, but if I kept naming and shaming individual billionaires funding right-wing media, we'd be here all day. So instead, let's round this out by looking at a vehicle instead of a person. Donors Trust is a donor-advised fund that's been called the dark money ATM of the conservative movement. It's given money to the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, and Leonard Leo's 85 Fund, to name just a few. Donor-advised funds are basically charitable giving middlemen. Instead of giving directly to a foundation, rich people put their money into a donor-advised fund, which then takes their advice, recommendations, donor-advised, about where the funds should go. It's a win-win for the rich person who gets to claim the tax deduction immediately, whether or not the money has actually been distributed yet, avoid the administrative aspects of giving, and duck capital gains taxes. Perhaps most importantly, though, it puts a smokescreen between the rich person and their priorities, because donor-advised funds aren't required to disclose their donors. In 2021, Donor Trust took in more than $1 billion, and most of it came from just 2 anonymous donors. So though we can name and shame, we don't even know how much some of these people have actually given. The same year, Donors Trust started funneling millions into a network of conservative media entities that included the now-defunct Project Veritas, known for its deceptively edited and covertly recorded videos targeting mainstream news outlets, labor organizations, and Democratic politicians. Our good friend Laura Loomer, remember her 15 Minutes of Fame? She worked with them very briefly. The American Spectator, which recently defended Moms for Liberty, the parents' rights organization that has been designated as an extremist group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Metric Media and the Pipeline Media network, which is comprised of nearly 1,300 pay-for-play partisan news sites and reportedly published more than 2,000 stories relating to the integrity of the 2020 election. Additional Metric media backers include our pal Dick Uihlein, Peter Thiel, and the Franklin News Foundation, which has ties to the Koch network. The Kochs deserve their own deep dive, coming soon, but it feels worth mentioning that they also fund the climate-skeptical libertarian outfit Reason Magazine. And if you, like me, are like, this deeply secretive, complicated web of billionaire donors and covert operatives using money to gain influence reminds me of something. What is it? What could it be? Campaign finance. It's dark money donors who give to organizations who place ads meant to manipulate us into voting certain ways, or give to politicians whose laws and votes will benefit the nameless, faceless billionaires backing the dark money ventures. The network is one and the same, because it's all part of the same larger playbook. Controlling the media, which we've spent today talking about, is one branch of the conservative beast, sometimes called the 𝗏𝗧𝗏 because of how involved the Koch brothers are in all of this. The birth of this movement can be traced to a number of things, but one of those is the Powell Memo, a secret document written by Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell that has gone down in infamy as the inspiration behind all of this. I made a whole episode about it. You should watch that next. So what can we do about all this? Honestly, not much. Sorry, I'm starting to get a little cynical about how much power we actually have in the face of stupid men with billions of dollars to burn. But education is what I turn to when I'm feeling powerless. And that could mean actually tuning in to Fox News once in a while to see what the other side is talking about if you have the stomach for it, because it's important to know what you're up against. Read books like Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which help uncover the billionaires pulling the strings in media and in our politics. And also, take a break from news media altogether. It's important to stay informed, but it's very easy to become burnt out by it all. You do not need to follow what Trump or your other favorite Republican to hate is doing every minute of every day. There is little you can do about any of it at this point, and being hyper-vigilant is a clear symptom of anxiety, as my therapist would say. Don't fully check out, but fighting the good fight takes many, many years, so you can't burn yourself out right at the beginning. I didn't read any news for the last 3 days, very much on purpose. If I, a person whose literal job it is to read the news, can take a few days off, so can you. Take care of yourself. If you're interested in learning more about money and politics, eating the rich and building class solidarity, etc., I invite you to join me over on Patreon, where we're planning some initiatives to help build community in Trump's America. Plus, you get ad-free and uncensored versions of all these episodes as well. Go to patreon.com/Leeja Miller to join. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons Rex, T, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. And if you haven't caught it yet, check out my video from a while ago about the Powell Memo that started it all. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.